want to take a little time right now to go through Appendix E, or at least a couple of the questions on it, on supply and demand, just to review how to go through these questions. These are maybe a little more complex than the earlier questions. These are certainly representative of what you would see on an exam. Again, this is Appendix E in microeconomics. Let me explain the question. We'll start with the first one and really kind of build off of that for the subsequent questions. The first question says, let me make sure I get this right, a price floor on good R is imposed at equilibrium, the current equilibrium. So first let's show that, okay? We'll draw a typical market equilibrium with its equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And then we're going to impose a price floor, good, a price floor at that price. So we say, look, this price right here is now the floor. And with a price floor, that means that the equilibrium price, even if it shows below that, the market is not allowed to achieve that new equilibrium price if it goes below the floor. That's the lowest price permitted in the market. Pardon me. Let's see what happens next in the question, though. It says, subsequent to this price floor, the price of a substitute in consumption, good S, a substitute in consumption, falls. So there's our first change to the market. The price of a substitute in consumption falls. How will that affect this market? Substitutes in consumption. You can buy this one or buy that one, right? You can buy, I don't know, you can buy a Chevrolet or you can buy a Ford. Well, if the price of one falls, people buy more of it, right? And so they buy less of the good you have in question. So the price, this is good R, the price of S falls, so the demand for good R will also decrease. Okay? That's the first thing that's happening in this market. And so as the demand curve decreases, we see that the equilibrium price tries to move down here, does, but the market price is not allowed to fall. Okay? That's where we're going. But something else was happening here in the question as well. It says, at the same time, that's always, three key words, 4 words, at the same time, a tax is imposed on the sellers of this market. Whoa, what happens when you put a tax on sellers? Which curve is affected up here? Well, now we're going to affect the supply curve, the seller's curve. And our general rule is, when we see a market where both curves are going to be disturbed or shifted, we ought to draw 2 different graphs to show those effects. So over here, let's draw the market as we started it, in equilibrium, at the equilibrium price, that's also a price floor. So here's where we start, price and quantity. But now this is a price floor. And now we put a tax on the sellers, right? Guess we ought to label these. When you put a tax on the sellers, that is in essence adding to their cost of producing and selling the good. So think of it, if you like, an increase in the cost of production. A tax on the sellers will decrease the supply curve. So we have this effect going on, and over here, remember, we had a decrease in demand going on. And so our equilibrium was moving from point A to point B, except the price is not allowed to drop. And then over here, our equilibrium is going to go, let's say, from point C up here to point D. So both of these things are trying to happen at the same time. And that's where we want to start with these questions. Which curve is going to shift and in which direction? And sometimes both curves shift. When both curves shift, we want to draw a separate graph to illustrate each shift of the curve. Okay? When the demand curve and the supply curve both change, draw 2 separate graphs. Because if you try to put all this on one graph, you're not going to be able to read it. Let's look over here and see what happens. The demand curve is now shifted to the left. Equilibrium is down here, but the price is still stuck up here. It's not allowed to fall. So what does that mean? Well, it means that this demand curve doesn't exist anymore. And so we have a price floor above equilibrium. What does that do? Well, that's the price we're stuck with, so we read to each curve. If we can't read to the equilibrium, read to each curve. Read at this price, read over to the supply curve. There is the quantity supplied. But also at this price, read to the demand curve, the new demand curve, read down. There is the quantity demanded. And so when we have an equilibrium below the price floor, and the market price can't fall, we necessarily have a surplus. So one of the possible outcomes in this whole problem of both curves shifting, one of the possible outcomes is that we'll wind up with a surplus. But let's look at the other one. Is the price allowed to rise from C to D? Sure, it's above the floor. So another possible outcome is that we reach a new equilibrium with a higher price increases, and with a smaller equilibrium quantity. Quantity decreases. So this is a possibility, and this is a possibility. And if you think of it this way, what was trying to happen over here? What they were trying to do in the market, or what the market was attempting to do, was to see the price fall, remember, going to go to here, and the quantity would have decreased. Quantity decreased. If you look at these two together, what do you see they have in common? You see that the quantity decreases. Okay? It is possible, and now I'm going to show this over on one graph. It is possible with a decrease in supply and a decrease in demand to right here, that you could wind up over here. You see that? When both curves shift just enough, they can keep the same price. And as a result, you'd have a new equilibrium where the price was unchanged, but the quantity had decreased. So this is still another possibility here. And this is the one that's easy to overlook. If you ignore the floor and go through these shifts, you'll get this and this and this. No problem. But then you got to remember, well, wait a minute, if the price does drop, well, it's not allowed to, so we'll wind up with a surplus. So where are we going with our correct answer? Well, you could get to a new equilibrium with a higher price and a smaller quantity. You could get to a new equilibrium with the same price and a smaller quantity. Or you could move to a point of having a surplus, depending on which curve, the demand curve or the supply curve, which one moves the furthest. If the supply curve moves way over and the demand curve just barely shifts, you could wind up here. But if you have a huge decrease in demand and a small decrease in supply, you could still wind up down here. So this makes it one of the tougher questions. Is how do I find all this stuff out? And again, we know both curves are moving, draw two graphs. The price floor complicates it, but look at what's trying to happen. We're trying to drive the price down, we're trying to drive the price up. We're not sure what's going to happen. But we do know that the quantity is getting smaller in every case. And then we go into the exception where, oh, if the price does try to fall down to here to a new equilibrium, well, it can't because we'll wind up with a surplus. So then the task is, if you can see the graphs, and you're going through the question one element at a time, picking out the stuff you know and diagramming it, then the real challenge after you get that and see the graphs, go to the answers and read through the answers very carefully. And you know that if an answer is not absolutely always true, then it's not correct. All right? This was kind of a messy one, but it gives you a sense of the way some of the test questions can go.